Welcome to The Explainer. So imagine waking up one morning and the most basic democratic right you have, your vote, is just violently yanked right out from under you. That's exactly what we're looking at today. We're unpacking the high-stakes political crisis of Azania. It's this gripping, honestly terrifying look at how unbelievably fast democratic institutions can crumble and what ordinary citizens are actually willing to do to build them back up. Okay, let's dive into this. I did not build this government to lose it. Just let that sink in for a second. That single, chilling sentence was spoken by Azania's president, Augustus Kane, right on election night. And it perfectly sets the stage for the dramatic showdown we're going to be examining today. Because, when a leader starts viewing the government as their own personal property instead of a public trust, well, the whole system is literally put in jeopardy. To really get how Azania reached this dangerous precipice, we've got to look at the country itself first. Azania is this vast, gorgeous, incredibly resource-rich nation. And for decades, the citizens there were told and deeply believed that democracy was absolutely their greatest achievement. So our story kicks off on the morning of a national election. Millions of people, including this passionate young journalist named Daniel Okoro, are standing in long lines, fully believing that their votes actually matter. The vibe is totally celebratory. There is just immense, hopeful faith in the system. But secretly, beneath all that celebration, a slow rot had been taking place. And that rot really comes down to this number right here, 12. President Kane had been in power for 12 long years. Now, when he first got into office, he promised all these reforms. He was totally celebrated. But over the course of those 12 years, his grip on the nation slowly, almost invisibly at first, began to tighten. Keeping power basically became way more important to him than the actual people he was elected to serve. Here is the exact authoritarian playbook Kane used, mapped out step by step. First, you promise reform and get the people on your side. Second, you quietly start arresting your critics. Third, you intimidate the independent journalists. And finally, you pack all the public institutions with your political loyalists. It was this super gradual slide into authoritarianism, so gradual, in fact, that his most hardcore supporters were literally calling him the father of the nation. By the time election night rolls around, the system is already deeply compromised. And the escalation? It's terrifyingly fast. By midnight, it's completely clear that the opposition candidate, David Mensa, is winning. The crowds are out in the streets celebrating. But then at 1 a.m., boom, the Electoral Commission suddenly suspends the results, citing quote-unquote technical difficulties. By 2 a.m., a complete media blackout hits. All the screens just go dark. And by dawn, military trucks are physically blocking the major roads in the capital, Freedom City. Meanwhile, inside this darkened newsroom, that young journalist, Daniel Okoro, and his editor, Miriam Adeyemi, are just watching this nightmare unfold. Miriam hits the nail on the head. She says it plainly. The government is preparing something. They both realize instantly that those heavily armed soldiers rolling through their streets, they aren't there to protect the citizens. It's a massive, coordinated, democratic cover-up. And as Daniel grabs his notebook, it hits him. Somebody has to document what is about to happen. Sure enough, the very next morning, the official government crackdown officially begins. The state announces this indefinite delay of the election results. They completely block internet access to stop the flow of information entirely. And President Kane takes to the airwaves, claiming that enemies of the state are actively trying to destabilize the country. It's a pretty classic tactic, masking brutal control as an effort to protect the state. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the stark contrast between the two forces colliding here in Azania. On one side, you have the government relying completely on fear, lies, violence, and arrests, literally deploying tear gas to break up peaceful gatherings in Freedom Square. But on the flip side, the people's defense is entirely rooted in truth, peace, the meticulous preservation of evidence, and underground reporting. The citizens basically refuse to play by the autocrats' rules. They're just not doing it. And that massive refusal leads directly to the creation of the people's voice. See, with the official media completely shut down and journalists starting to disappear, citizens like Daniel, Miriam, and this incredibly fearless student leader named Amara Bello decide to go underground. They set up this whole grassroots truth-telling operation. They're out there interviewing citizens, documenting the reality on the streets, all to preserve the evidence the state is trying so hard to erase. Their entire core philosophy is summed up perfectly by Amara Bello. Our weapon must be the truth. It's a highly, highly disciplined choice by the resistance. Miriam reminds everyone that if the government is using fear and lies, well, they can't. If the resistance resorts to the state's violent tactics, they basically become exactly what they are fighting against. And they knew that.
So while the citizens are unifying and getting stronger, the regime itself is actually starting to fracture. The immense pressure from foreign governments, from religious leaders, plus a rapidly collapsing economy, it all starts to crack Kane's inner circle. There's this unbelievably tense exchange between President Kane and his chief advisor, Victor Malek. Kane demands loyalty, barking at him, "You are forgetting who gave you your position." And Victor just looks at him and replies, "The Constitution did, sir, not you." I mean, wow. In that exact moment, it becomes undeniably clear that Kane's loyalty to his own power has completely eclipsed any loyalty he ever had to his own yet.
Which brings us to the massive climax of this whole resistance, the Great March. We're talking millions of Azanians, farmers, students, doctors, market women, retired soldiers. They all gather peacefully across the entire country. It literally becomes the largest demonstration in the nation's history. And they're all carrying one unified, totally undeniable message: let the people decide.
And that leads us to the ultimate terrifying question. Is the president going to order a violent crackdown? Inside the presidential palace, Kane and his generals are watching these millions of people on television. The tension is just absolutely off the charts. He has the military power to clear those streets by force, but doing so means crossing a line he can never come back from. His advisor straight up warns him that whatever he decides to do in the next few minutes is going to determine how history remembers him forever.
And then, the turning point. After what felt like hours of dead silence, the autocrat finally blinks. Kane sits down and actually orders his generals to stand down. The military lowers its weapons. Because the people manage to remain unified and, most importantly, peaceful, they force a massive concession from the state. The government finally agrees to reopen the electoral process, but this time under strict, independent supervision.
So, a few months later, Azania holds a second election. But this time around, the actual mechanics of democracy are fiercely protected. You've got a reformed electoral commission, international observers are everywhere, and everyday citizens are watching literally every single stage of the process. And when the results are finally announced, the opposition candidate, David Mensa, secures a totally fair victory. As you can imagine, celebrations just absolutely erupt all over Freedom City. But here's the thing, amidst all that cheering and celebrating, Daniel Okoro stays pretty quiet. When someone asks him why he isn't jumping for joy, he points out that winning an election, that isn't the end of the struggle. The real work, he says, is making sure that whoever wins never becomes an autocrat. And that is such a profound realization. Removing a dictator is really only half the battle, right? The other half is making absolutely sure the system is strong enough to prevent the next one from popping up. This whole crisis ultimately becomes the core curriculum taught to future generations in the country. They call it the Azanian lesson. The main takeaways are crystal clear. First, institutions matter. Second, leaders are servants of the public, not owners of the government. Third, citizens have everyday responsibilities. And finally, people have to actively protect the rule of law. Because democracy doesn't just survive on autopilot, it requires constant everyday maintenance. Fast forward years later, and an elderly Daniel Okoro is asked by a young student, was this struggle worth it? Did democracy win? And Daniel's response is incredibly grounding. He looks at the strong functional institutions all around them and realizes, they didn't go through all that just for one politician. They fought for the rights of every future generation. He tells the student that democracy never wins forever. Actually, scratch that. It's more like democracy has to be actively defended by every single generation, over and over again.
I want to leave you with this final, really powerful thought from this source material. When power forgets the people, democracy becomes fragile. When the people remember their power, democracy can rise again. I mean, what a phenomenal summary of Azania's fight, right? And honestly, it's a deeply provocative reminder for all of us. Because no matter where you live, institutions are fragile. It's always up to the citizens to remember their power. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this deep dive leaves you reflecting on the everyday mechanics of the free societies that we, quite frankly, so often take for granted.